There's a report that was released today by Human Rights Watch on enforced disappearances. The 87 report dubbed deaths and disappearances abuses in counter-terrorism operations in Nairobi and northeastern Kenya. So let's have a conversation with Ken Roth, his Executive Director, Human Rights Watch, in just a few minutes. But before we do that, let's take a look at some of what was contained in that particular report by Human Rights Watch. So 34, that is the number of people who have disappeared, quote unquote, in northeastern Kenya and Nairobi, 34. Let's move to the next board as we quickly look at some of the facts that we'll be talking about with Ken Roth in a few minutes. The number of people who have so far disappeared stands at 24. And of course, this is being pointed at abusive counter-terrorism operations in the country. So the areas that the Human Rights Watch focused on was Nairobi and northeastern counties, to be specific. Let's take a look at the specific counties that Human Rights Watch focused on. That is Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera. So Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera have seen a total of about 34 people, quote unquote, disappearing. Let's have that conversation now with Ken Roth. He's the Executive Director, Human Rights Watch. Thank you for joining us on KTN Prime tonight.
My pleasure to be here, Linda.
So the 87-page report, it's titled Deaths and Disappearances, Abuses in Counter-Terrorism Operations in Nairobi and Northeastern Kenya. So, of course, just from the title of your report, it points to a certain direction on who is responsible for the disappearances that we have seen in the 2 years. Where would you point your finger at?
Well, it's very clear who was responsible. We did a very detailed study speaking to various eyewitnesses of these operations. We spoke to a number of people who had been detained with the disappearance victims, but the survivors had been released and other people just disappeared. We actually spoke to 9 security officials who could describe from the inside what had happened. And basically, it is a combination of security forces led foremost by the Kenyan Defense Forces, the KDF, the military, but operating with the police, with intelligence units, and actually with the Kenyan Wildlife Service as well. And what we found is typically plainclothes security officers would abduct the person, often at their home. They would then sometimes be brought to a police station, but not registered. But very quickly, they would end up either in a military base or in the forest where the military had built up a temporary encampment. Now, we actually looked altogether at 45 cases where this had happened. In 11 cases, bodies were found. In 34 cases, the people have never been seen again. They have utterly disappeared.
Basically disappeared from the face of the earth. You have no idea where they are or what could have happened to them.
Well, we obviously fear the worst. We fear that they're dead. But the terrible thing about a disappearance is that, the families have no idea. They can't even really grieve for their loved ones because they don't know for sure. And what happened time and time again is that people would go to the police and say, the security forces just took my brother, my father, what have you, and please help. And we have no evidence that there was any follow-up by the police. There was no inquests that we're aware of in the case of the 11 dead people. There are no investigations we're aware of in the case of the 34 disappeared people.
It's interesting that you mentioned family members of the people who have disappeared, because normally when someone disappears, you go to the police and you report that, and then you file a missing persons report. Has this been done in the 34 cases? What sort of help have they gotten? And like you say, the residents and the family members have really not gotten enough help from the police. As Human Rights Watch, have you gotten any help? Have you tried to figure out where are these people? What could have happened to them? What sort of response have you gotten from security agents in the counties that you've touched on?
Well, in the writing of the report, we wrote detailed letters to the KDF, to the police, to the relevant ministers, and got no response from anybody other than the Kenyan Wildlife Service, who said, we don't know anything. Now, today I actually happened to meet with the Inspector General of the Police, and we, of course, gave him the report, and he's promised to look into this, in particular to look into why have the police not done investigations in the Northeast? Why is there not the kind of follow-up, Linda, that you're describing? A family ordinarily has a right to expect, particularly when somebody's been abducted. Now, the other thing that we're asking is with respect to President Uhuru Kenyatta himself, because this is a deeply disturbing pattern of disappearances by Kenyan security forces. And we all know that there is IPOA, that is the oversight agency for the police. There is no IPOA for the military, and the military is clearly at the heart of this. So we've asked the president to establish a so-called commission of inquiry that would be capable of investigating everybody's involvement and looking beyond the Northeast, because frankly, we only looked at the Northeast. And we suspect that there are comparable problems elsewhere in the country. There certainly are reports of similar problems. Now, we hope that the government will respond constructively to this. We hope that the president will say, this is terrible, we want to stop this, and I'm appointing a commission of inquiry to put an end to it. I hope he doesn't resort to the denial and obfuscation, which will frankly be just a green light for these disappearances to continue.
You don't seem to think, from what you've explained, this is being done by some quarters of the military. You don't seem to think that this is, quote-unquote, rogue military officials that are doing this?
You know, that's one of the defenses you would expect government officials to say. But what's interesting is this couldn't possibly be a rogue operation. This is an incredibly sophisticated coordination of multiple security force agencies. When you have the KDF, the police, the intelligence agencies, the Kenyan Wildlife Service all operating together, that is not a rogue operation. That is an operation that had to have been authorized at relatively high levels in order to get all those different security forces operating together. So this isn't rogue. This isn't the other thing that sometimes you hear, oh, these people just disappeared to join al-Shabaab.
Yeah, that is actually the other explanation.
That's the other explanation. But what we have time and time again is eyewitnesses seeing the people put into government vehicles, seeing the vehicles bring people to the police station or ultimately bring them to the police base, to the military base. We have, insiders, former detainees, security officials who tell us the people were there. So the only place where these people disappeared to was into the hands of the military. So they didn't go off to al-Shabaab.
So they ended up in the military. How do we put a stop to this?
Well, the only way to stop it is from the top. This is clearly an authorized operation at senior levels. That's why the president needs to step in. He needs to admit what's happening, not go into denial. He needs to condemn it, say that this is not what Kenya stands for. This is not only wrong, but it's utterly ineffective for combating terrorism because it alienates the communities whose cooperation you need. And we need the president to appoint that commission of inquiry to get to the bottom of this and to make sure that it really does come to an end.
All right. Ken Roth, Executive Director, Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for speaking to us on KTN Prime. As we look at that report that was released today, deaths and disappearances in Kenya specific, in Nairobi and northeastern Kenya, thank you so much for creating time for us. Of course, due to time, we have to end this conversation, but I'm trying to convince Ken Roth to be part of a conversation as well, just looking at this particular report. So tomorrow he'll be speaking to Betty Chalo on News Center. That's from 10 a.m. to, I think, midday, in between 10 a.m. and midday probably. We'll have Ken Roth as well, just to have an extensive conversation on this report that they released today. You're watching KTN Prime. Thank you for staying with us. Let's take a breather. We'll be back.